My name is Dana Kessler, I'm 44 years old, and the night I found the drawing, I was doing what I always did on a Sunday, folding my husband's clothes from his week away, sorting them into whites and darks on our bed. That's when a piece of paper fell out of his duffel bag. Not a receipt, not a note, a child's drawing, done in careful crayon, a stick figure man standing next to a stick figure little girl, both of them holding hands under a yellow sun. Across the top, in a child's uneven print, it said "World's Best Daddy." I stood there holding it for a long moment, the laundry basket balanced on my hip, before I called down the hallway. "Grant, whose is this?" He came to the doorway in his undershirt, damp-haired from the shower, took one look at the paper in my hand, and didn't even reach for it. "It's from one of my cousin's kids," he said, already turning to dig through his sock drawer, as though the matter were beneath a second glance. "They adore me down there. You're being paranoid again, Dana. Not everything is about you and your spreadsheets." I set the drawing down on the dresser, smoothed the crease out of it with 2 fingers, the way I'd smooth a crumpled invoice before filing it, and said, "Okay. Just that, babe." I went back to folding his shirts, matching the collars, the way I'd done every Sunday for 16 years. What Grant didn't know, what he had no reason to suspect, because I had never once given him cause to think I wasn't exactly the trusting, tidy, reasonable wife he'd built his second life around, was that I had already spent 3 years quietly reconciling numbers that didn't belong to our household. I balance books for a living. I notice when $400 a month disappears into nothing. Had noticed. I'd just been waiting for the arithmetic to catch up to the truth. Let me tell you how I got here. I grew up the daughter of a small-town accountant in western North Carolina, a man named Everett Kessler who kept a ledger for the church, the volunteer fire department, and half the businesses on Main Street, all for free, because he believed numbers told the truth even when people didn't want to hear it. I used to sit at his elbow at the kitchen table while he worked, watching columns add up under his pencil, and I loved the certainty of it. The way 2 + 2 never had an opinion about you, never lied, never needed managing. I got my CPA license at 24. By 31 I'd opened my own firm, Kessler & Associates, in a converted storefront in Asheville. 3 employees to start, 11 by the time this story really begins. Did well. I did it myself mostly, working Saturdays for the first 6 years, turning down 2 buyout offers from bigger firms because I wanted my name on the door and nobody else's hand on the wheel. My mother died when I was 19, midway through my second year of college, and my father never remarried. It was just the 2 of us in that house on Elm after that. Him teaching me to close out a general ledger the way other fathers teach their daughters to change a tire, out of a plain conviction that a woman ought to know how to take care of herself. I put myself through the rest of school on a mix of scholarships and weekend bookkeeping work for 2 dentists and a landscaping company. And by the time I sat for my CPA exam, I'd already been keeping other people's secrets in double entry form for 3 years. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from that. From knowing, cell by cell, exactly how a business or a household actually runs, rather than how it presents itself at the dinner table. I carried that confidence into everything I did afterward, including, for a long time, my marriage. I married Grant Pruitt when I was 28. He was warm in those years, easy to laugh, the kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee after the first time he made it for you, who showed up at my father's memorial service with a casserole his own mother had made, unasked, because he'd noticed I hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. His family ran Pruitt Monuments and Memorial Company, a headstone and memorial business 3 generations deep in Buncombe County, founded by his grandfather, run in my time by his father, Earl, and eventually by Grant and his younger brother, Todd. Earl was a broad, gentle man with granite dust permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, and he treated me, from the very first Sunday dinner, less like a daughter-in-law and more like a colleague he'd been waiting years to hire. When Earl's longtime bookkeeper retired the year after Grant and I married, Earl asked me almost sheepishly over pie if I'd take a look at the books, just till we find someone permanent. I never stopped looking. 16 years later I was still the one who filed Pruitt Monument's quarterly taxes, still the one who reconciled their accounts payable every month, a private arrangement that had nothing to do with being Grant's wife and everything to do with being good at what I did. It was, in fact, a paid contract, invoiced separately from my firm's other clients, and I want to say that clearly because it matters later. I wasn't doing a favor for family. I was the outside accountant who happened to have married in. Earl used to tell people at Thanksgiving with a little pride in his voice, "My daughter-in-law is the only person alive who understands where all our money goes." I don't think he knew when he said it, how literally true that would one day turn out to be. The early years of the marriage were good in the unremarkable way most good marriages are, which is to say there isn't much to tell about them. We bought a craftsman bungalow off Merrimon Avenue. Grant learned to work around my Saturday hours. I learned to work around his sales trips. We didn't have children, a choice we'd made together early and never revisited with any bitterness, which left more room, I think now, for both my business and eventually, for whatever he was building on the side. Earl died of a stroke when I was 39, 7 years ago now, and in the grief and reorganization that followed, Todd stepping fully into operations, Grant stepping fully into sales and family relations, a phrase I now understand rather differently than I did then. Nobody thought to hand the books to anyone else. I simply kept doing what I'd always done. I had one ritual that never moved for anyone. Every night at 9 o'clock, no matter what kind of day it had been, I sat at the small desk in our sunroom with a mug that said "Trust the Numbers," a gift from my father the year I got licensed, chipped now on the handle, and I went through the day's figures, mine and once a month Pruitt Monuments. It was never a chore to me. There's a stillness in reconciling a ledger that I've never found anywhere else, a sense of a day being put properly to bed, every column accounted for, nothing left owing. Grant used to tease me about it early on, leaning in the sunroom doorway with 2 fingers of bourbon, watching me work. "You married the books, not me," he'd say, and I'd tell him the books never left their socks on the floor, and he'd laugh, and sometimes he'd bring me a second cup of tea without my asking, and set it down beside the first one going cold, and kiss the top of my head on his way to bed. It was a joke between us for a long time, a good one, the kind of joke that's really just a way of saying I see you and I like what I see. Later it stopped being a joke and started being the only thing in the house that told me the truth. The trouble, when it started, didn't announce itself. It came in the shape of a week every August that Grant called family time. A trip down to Boone, 2.5 hours east, to see his mother, Carol, and to check on his late aunt's old cabin property that the family still held onto, a modest place off the Blue Ridge Parkway that had belonged to Earl's sister before she passed. Had always been a week. It had been a week since the second year we were married, before we even had a mortgage together, and I'd never questioned it, because family obligation was something I understood in my bones. I'd have done the same for my own mother if she were still living, and I told myself as much more than once, in the years I let it go unexamined. He'd leave on a Sunday with a duffel bag I'd usually help him pack, come home the following Saturday or Sunday a little sunburned, a little quiet for a day or two, distracted in the particular way men get when they've spent a week being somebody's whole world and then have to shrink back down to being one half of a marriage again. I used to think that quiet was homesickness for his mother. I know now it was something closer to grief, the small daily grief of a man living 2 lives and loving, in his own broken way, both of them. Every year, the week would end, and things would go back to normal, and I would fold his laundry, the way I always did, sorting the mountain trip clothes into whites and darks on our bed on the Sunday after he came home, a ritual as fixed in its way as my 9 o'clock ledger. For 6 years, folding that laundry was just laundry. It never once occurred to me to wonder why a man visiting his elderly mother and checking on a fishing cabin needed a week's worth of clean button-downs, or why he came home every August with a faint tan line at his wrist where a watch had been that he didn't wear at home. It was the 4th year of this pattern, I think, when I first noticed the wire transfers. $600 a month, sometimes a little more, routed out of a Pruitt Monuments operating sub-account to something called Foster Realty Holdings. I remember sitting with a statement in front of me, running my finger down the column, thinking it was probably a storage unit, or a lease on equipment, something dull and explainable. I made a note in the margin, "Ask Earl." And then Earl had his stroke that winter, and the note sat there unasked, for longer than I'd like to admit. I want to be honest with you about something. For a long time I chose not to look harder. Not because I was foolish. I don't think I've ever been foolish about money in my life. But because looking harder meant admitting there might be something to find. And I had built a marriage, a business, 16 years of Sunday dinners and shared taxes, and a life I liked the shape of, around the idea that Grant, whatever his flaws, was fundamentally telling me the truth. It is a strange thing, being the kind of woman who catches every discrepancy in other people's businesses and somehow lets her own sit unexamined on a shelf for 3 years. I've thought about that a lot since. I think most people do it. I think it's the most human thing in the world, and I no longer feel foolish about it. I just feel like someone who finally turned the light on in a room she'd been avoiding. There was a stretch, the 5th year of Foster Realty Holdings showing up on the ledger, when things got good again. Genuinely good, not performed, or at least it felt that way from where I sat, which I've since learned is not the same thing as it actually being true. Grant cut his August trip down to 4 days that year, called his mother instead of driving out twice a month, started coming home from the office earlier, started noticing things again. My new haircut, a hard week at the firm, the fact that I'd been favoring my left knee since a fall on the Greenway. He took me to Charleston for our anniversary in October and didn't check his phone once at dinner, which for him was practically a miracle. And on the second night, walking back to the hotel along the Battery with the harbor lights on the water, he stopped under a street lamp and said, "I know I've been somewhere else for a while. I'm trying to come back." I remember how badly I wanted that to be a true sentence. We even went to see a marriage counselor for 6 sessions that spring, not because of some crisis I could have named at the time, but because a friend of mine, Priya, who runs the marketing firm 2 doors down from mine, had recommended her own therapist for a tune-up, half joking the way successful women in their 40s talk about maintenance. Grant, to my surprise, agreed without an argument. He sat in that office in a low leather chair across from a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Amara Voss and said things like, "I know I disappear into my head sometimes, and I want to do better by her." And I watched him say it and I believed him because I wanted to, and because for a few months running the evidence actually supported it. He started coming to the sunroom at 9 o'clock some nights, not to tease me anymore but to sit across from me with a book, quietly, just to be in the room. The transfers to Foster Realty Holdings stopped entirely for 2 billing cycles that spring. I checked obsessively at first, and then less obsessively, and then I stopped checking at all for a stretch of nearly 10 weeks, which had not happened in the 4 years prior. I remember thinking, almost giddy about it, standing at my kitchen counter with a bank statement in hand. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it really was a storage unit and they just switched vendors or closed the account or moved on from whatever it was. I nearly deleted the folder of statements I'd started keeping on my own laptop, separate from the firm's server, just in case anyone ever asked why I had it. I opened the folder that night, my cursor hovering over it, and some old stubborn instinct my father had put in me at the kitchen table on Elm Street, made me close the laptop instead and leave it exactly where it was. I'm glad now, more than I can easily say, that I did. The transfers started again in October, and by the following August Grant's family week had stretched to 9 days, then to a week and a half the year after that, with a story each time that made perfect, reasonable sense on its own. His mother's hip, a cousin's wedding, the aunt's cabin needing a new roof before winter. Each explanation was plausible. It was only when I lined them up end to end, the way I'd line up a decade of invoices looking for a pattern of fraud, that I saw what they actually were. A structure. A second life, built one reasonable excuse at a time, the way you build anything that isn't supposed to be found, quietly and in installments. The night with the drawing was the night the structure stopped being theoretical. I didn't sleep much. I lay next to Grant listening to him breathe, easy and untroubled, and I thought about all the reasonable words he'd used over 6 years. My mother, the cabin, the roof, my cousin's kids, and how each one taken alone had sounded exactly like the truth. That's the thing nobody tells you about a well-built lie. It doesn't sound like a lie. Sounds like Tuesday. The morning after I found it, I did the only thing that made sense to me. I made coffee, sat at my own kitchen table before Grant woke, and called my Aunt Ruth. Ruth Kessler is my late father's older sister, 71 years old, and for 30 years before she retired she worked as a paralegal for a family law firm in Charlotte, the kind of place that handled ugly divorces and uglier custody fights. She has a mind like a filing cabinet and absolutely no patience for a lie once she's caught the scent of one. When I told her about the drawing, and then, because I could hear her getting ready to ask, about the 6 years of Foster Realty Holdings transfers, she was quiet for a second on the phone, and then she said, "Dana, honey, have you looked up that name?" I hadn't. It had never occurred to me, in 3 years of noticing the transfers, to simply type the name of the recipient into a search engine, because some part of me had decided that not looking was the same thing as it not being true. Ruth talked me through it that same afternoon, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table with her reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair. Foster Realty Holdings turned out to be a single-member LLC registered with the North Carolina Secretary of State 4 years earlier. Its registered agent a P.O. box in Boone. Its sole member listed as a woman named Renee Foster. "Could be nothing," Ruth said, in the careful voice of a woman who has said that sentence 1,000 times and meant it maybe twice. "Could be a business partner. Could be a real estate deal that's got nothing to do with him." It wasn't nothing. Boone County property records, which are public and take about 4 minutes to search if you know where to look, showed a modest 3-bedroom house on Sourwood Lane, purchased 6 years earlier. The deed held under Foster Realty Holdings LLC. The Watauga County School District's public enrollment directory. The kind of thing that exists for parent associations and PTA rosters, not for spouses playing detective, but public all the same. Listed 2 children at the elementary school 2 streets over from Sourwood Lane, last name Pruitt Foster. A boy age 9. A girl age 6 whose grade placement lined up, when I did the small, ugly arithmetic in my head, with roughly 9 months after that very good year, the year of the marriage counselor and the anniversary trip to Charleston and the 2 billing cycles where the transfer stopped. I did not cry at my kitchen table. I want to tell you that honestly because I think people expect a woman to fall apart at a moment like that, and I didn't. I felt, instead, a kind of icy clarity I recognized from 20 years of forensic bookkeeping. The specific stillness that comes right before you find the number that breaks a case open. I picked up my mug, which had gone cold, and I carried it to the sink, and I poured it out, and I rinsed it, and I set it in the rack to dry. Ruth watched me do all of this without saying anything. Then she said, "You're not going to do anything rash, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm going to do this the way I do everything else. Correctly." Over the following 6 weeks, Ruth and I built what I would eventually in my head start calling the file, not out of any love of drama, but because that's what it was, a manila folder that grew fatter every few days, kept in the bottom drawer of the file cabinet at my office, behind a false-fronted folder labeled 1099 Archive, Do Not Discard. A small precaution Ruth insisted on, and I was glad for later. We met most Wednesday evenings after my staff had gone home, at the little table in my office's back kitchen. Ruth with her readers on a chain around her neck and a legal pad she filled in a shorthand only she could read. Ruth knew how to pull records the right way. How to request a property tax history without triggering a notification to the owner. How to search a business registry by registered agent rather than by name. How to cross-reference a mortgage lender's public filings against a preschool fundraiser flyer that Renee Foster had apparently chaired 2 years running. Her name and cell number printed at the bottom in a cheerful font, right there for anyone to see who thought to look. "People think secrets are hard to find," Ruth told me one of those Wednesdays, tapping her pen against a printout. "They're not. People think they're hard to find because nobody around them is willing to look. You just have to be willing." I contributed what I knew best, the money. I went back through 6 years of Pruitt Monuments accounts quietly on my own time after hours, cross-checking every wire to Foster Realty Holdings against the company's own books, matching dates against invoices, matching invoices against bank statements, the way I'd untangle a client's fraud case for a court filing. It came to just under $88,000 over 6 years, disguised in the ledger under a vendor code Grant himself had set up. I found the original entry, dated to the same month the Boone property closed. Labeled, with an almost insulting lack of imagination, Contract Labor Boone Property. Some months it was $600. Some months, closer to a school tuition payment or a roof repair, it spiked to over $2,000. I printed every wire confirmation and clipped them, chronologically, to a summary sheet I built myself. The kind of exhibit I'd hand a judge in a fraud case without a second thought. It was company money. Not our money, not exactly. Though of course as Grant's wife it touched ours too, since every dollar he siphoned out of Pruitt Monuments was a dollar that wasn't funding his own share of our household, wasn't funding the retirement account I'd been quietly overfunding for both of us for a decade. Company money, funneled to support a household 2.5 hours away that had, among other things, a Christmas photo, which Ruth eventually found on a public Facebook page belonging to Renee's sister. "No privacy settings at all," Ruth said, shaking her head, half in disgust and half in something like professional admiration, showing Grant in a red sweater in front of a tree strung with popcorn garland. His arm around Renee Foster, a slim woman with a wide, easy smile and 2 children who had his exact crooked grin. The caption read, "Our whole world right here." I sat with that photo open on my laptop for a long time the night Ruth sent it to me, not crying, just looking at it the way I'd look at a discrepancy I already knew the explanation for, needing only to see the number confirmed in black and white before I could move on to the next line of the ledger. Before I tell you what happened next, let me say this. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching this from, so if you've got a second, drop your city or country in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now, because what came after this part of the story is the part that still gets to me, even telling it now. The setback came in November, almost exactly a year after I found the drawing, at a moment I hadn't planned for and couldn't have. Todd, Grant's younger brother, called me on a Tuesday afternoon. His voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him. Todd handled operations at Pruitt Monuments, the stonework, the crews, the physical business of it, while Grant handled sales and I handled the numbers, and in 16 years Todd had never once questioned my books. That Tuesday he did. He'd been going through vendor codes for an insurance audit and found the contract labor, Boone property line, going back years with no invoices, number 1099s, nothing but a code and a dollar figure. "Dana," he said, "I need you to explain this to me, because right now it looks like somebody's been quietly bleeding this company for 6 years, and you're the one who signs off on the books." I sat very still at my desk. It was, I understood immediately, the worst possible version of this to unfold. Not because Todd was wrong to ask, but because the honest answer implicated his own brother, and the dishonest version of events, the version where I simply hadn't caught it, made me look either incompetent or complicit, either of which could cost me my license and the firm I'd spent 16 years building. I could hear, underneath Todd's controlled anger, something worse than suspicion of Grant, the beginning of suspicion of me. "I trusted you with these books for 16 years, he said, quieter now, which was somehow harder to hear than the sharpness before it. "I need to understand how something gets buried for 6 years and the person doing the books doesn't see it." I told Todd the truth, as much of it as I could give him in that moment, calmly, in the same tone I'd used to explain a depreciation schedule to a nervous client. I told him I'd flagged the vendor code years earlier, that the note was still sitting in my working files if he wanted to see the date on it, that I'd been quietly building documentation on exactly this issue for the better part of a year, and that I needed 48 hours before I brought everything to him properly, in writing, laid out the way it deserved to be laid out rather than delivered in a panic over the phone. Todd was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I could hear, faintly, the grinding hum of the shop floor behind him. Then he said, 48 hours, Dana. And then I'm calling our lawyer, family or not. I mean that." I hung up the phone and sat with my hands flat on the desk, and for the first time in a year of careful methodical work, I felt the ground actually shift under me. It wasn't fear of Grant anymore. It was the sharper, colder fear of watching my own professional life. My license, my firm, my reputation as the one person in that family whose numbers you could trust with your eyes closed, suddenly standing exactly where Grant's second life had been standing all along, on a foundation nobody had bothered to check. If Todd went to the family attorney before I'd had the chance to present my own documentation, on my own terms, I understood exactly how the story could be told. A wife who discovered her husband's affair and quietly punished the family business for it. A bookkeeper who let a discrepancy run for years and only produced a paper trail once she got caught. I had spent my whole career being the person whose word closed an argument. I was not going to let this be the one time it became evidence against me. I understood sitting there that I no longer had the luxury of moving slowly. Whatever I did next I had to do within days, and I had to do it in a way that protected me first because nobody else was going to. I called Ruth that night, and then I called an attorney the following morning. Not the family's attorney, a woman named Alicia Ferris I'd worked opposite on a business valuation case years earlier, someone with no loyalty to the Pruitt name at all. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, and when I finished she said, "Dana, you're going to want to do 4 things, and you're going to want to do them in a very specific order, starting today." So I did. The first thing I did was write a formal letter of resignation as Pruitt Monuments contracted accountant, effective immediately, citing an unspecified conflict of interest, 2 sentences long, nothing more. Because Alicia had taught me years ago in another case that the shortest letters are the hardest to argue with. I sent it to Todd and to the company's board. 3 people, Todd, Grant, and their mother Carol, by certified mail with a copy to Alicia, and I remember standing at the counter of the downtown post office on a gray Tuesday morning, watching the clerk stamp the receipt, thinking that 16 years of Sunday dinners and quarterly filings had come down to a single sheet of paper and a tracking number. The second thing I did was compile, in a single clean document with dates and figures and copies of every wire transfer, exactly what I'd found. 6 years of it, the vendor code, the LLC filing, the property records, the Facebook photograph, all of it labeled and tabbed the way I'd prepare an exhibit for a courtroom. And I gave it to Alicia to hold, not to use yet, just to hold. The way you hold a card you're not ready to play. "This isn't a weapon yet," she told me, sliding the folder into her own locked cabinet. "It's insurance. There's a difference, and you'll know which one you need when the time comes." The third thing I did was open a new account at a credit union across town, one Grant had never set foot in and didn't know existed, and I moved my personal savings and half of what sat in our joint account, the half that was legally mine, calculated to the dollar, because I wasn't going to give anyone the chance to call me a thief in a marriage where I'd been the only one keeping honest books, into it, quietly, over the course of 4 business days, in amounts small enough not to trigger a single alert on either end. I did it from my office on my lunch break, the same way I'd process a routine client transfer, because to my hands by then, it barely felt different. The fourth thing I did, the hardest one, was call the leasing office of the small downtown apartment building 2 blocks from my firm and sign a 6-month lease under my maiden name, effective the first of the following month, before I had said a single word to Grant about any of it. I remember sitting in my car in the leasing office parking lot afterward, engine off, just breathing for a minute, the way you do after you've finally set down something heavy you didn't realize you've been carrying with both arms. None of this involved raising my voice. None of it involved a scene. I remember standing in my kitchen the night I signed the lease, running my finger down the signature line on the copy the leasing agent had emailed me, and feeling something close, unexpectedly, to peace. The particular calm that comes not from winning an argument but from finally acting on numbers you've trusted for a very long time. Pruitt Monument's 75th anniversary gala had been on the calendar for over a year before any of this started. A Saturday evening in early December, held in the restored train depot downtown, 3 generations of the family's history laid out on easels along the brick walls, black and white photographs of Grant's grandfather's original stone yard next to color shots of the modern showroom. Employees and their families invited, 70-some people in all. A slideshow Carol had been working on for months, set to a Ray Charles record Earl had loved. Grant was set to give a short speech about legacy, standing at a small podium near the old ticket window, a toast his mother had asked him to write months earlier, long before any of this had a shape she could see. I was still listed on the invitation as the company's longtime accountant, a fact nobody had thought to change yet, because my resignation letter, by design, hadn't been formally announced to the wider family or the room full of employees who'd known me, some of them since Earl's funeral, only that it had landed on 3 desks 11 days earlier and stayed there, unspoken like a held breath. I went. Alicia had advised against it, gently, and Ruth had asked me twice if I was sure, and I told them both the same thing. I had spent 16 years being the person that family trusted with the truth of their numbers, and I intended to leave that role, if I was leaving it, on my own terms, in the room where it mattered, not in a private phone call where the story could be shaped by someone else afterward. Grant found me by the dessert table near the end of the evening. His face bright with a particular flush he got after 2 glasses of wine and a well-received toast. "You've been quiet tonight," he said. "Everything okay?" "I resigned as the company's accountant 3 weeks ago," I said. "Todd got the letter. I imagine your mother has it too by now." His face did something complicated. Surprise first, then the beginning of anger, carefully checked because we were standing 6 feet from his employees. "You didn't think to mention that to me?" "I did," I said. "I mentioned it to the board." "You're on the board." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to the register he used when he wanted to sound reasonable and sound like a threat at the same time. Dana, whatever this is about, we can talk about it at home. This isn't the place. You're right, I said. It's not really the place to talk about the $88,000 that's gone from this company's accounts to Foster Realty Holdings over the last 6 years either. But you brought it up first, so. I set my glass down on the table, gently, the way I'd set down anything I was finished with. Renee's a lovely name, by the way. I looked up the school directory. Your daughter's in 1st grade now. She draws very well for 6. I want to tell you his face went white because it did, but what I remember more clearly is the stillness that spread out around us. Todd 3 feet away, going quiet mid-sentence with someone else. Carol near the slideshow easel, turning her head at the change in the air the way mothers do. 2 of the longtime crew foremen exchanging a glance and drifting, with the particular tact of men who've worked with their hands their whole lives. A few steps further off. Nobody shouted. I didn't shout. Grant said very low, leaning in so only I would hear it. You have no idea what you're talking about, and I said at the same volume, level as a countertop. I have a folder that says I do, and it's currently sitting with an attorney who is not your family's attorney. I'd be happy to walk your mother through it whenever she'd like. Tonight, if she wants. Carol was already moving toward us by the time I finished the sentence, her heels quick and small against the depot's old wood floor. Her face arranged in the particular calm of a woman who has spent 78 years learning to hold a room together no matter what's happening inside it. What's going on? She said, not really a question, looking between the 2 of us. Grant opened his mouth. Got there first. I resigned as the company's accountant, Carol. I sent the letter to you and Todd 11 days ago. I imagine it's still sitting on your desk. Her eyes went very briefly to Grant, and something in them told me she already suspected more than she'd let herself say out loud. The way mothers sometimes do, keeping a private ledger of their own that they hope never to have to open. I'll come by Monday, I told her gently, because whatever else was true, she hadn't done anything to deserve the depot floor as the place she learned it. I'll bring everything. You should hear it from me, sitting down, not standing here. I left 20 minutes later on my own in my own car, and I did not look back to see how the rest of the evening went. I heard about it later in pieces from Ruth, who heard it from a cousin, and from Todd himself months afterward, over a much calmer cup of coffee. I don't need to tell you all of it. I'll just say that by January, Todd had brought in an outside forensic accountant to formally audit the 6 years I'd already documented, largely confirming line for line what I'd already handed Alicia. That Grant was removed from any signing authority on Pruitt Monuments accounts within the month, a decision the board made unanimously, Grant included, since he had, by then, very little standing left to argue from. And that Carol, 78 years old and married for 51 years to a man who never once, as far as any of us knew, kept a secret from her, sat with me for 2 hours over coffee at her kitchen table that January, going through the folder page by page without flinching, and said at the end of it, closing the folder gently with both hands, I always told Earl you were the only one in this family who couldn't be fooled by a spreadsheet. I didn't know it'd be the thing that saved us. The divorce took 9 months, which Alicia told me was fast, all things considered, mostly because I'd arrived with a folder so thorough there was very little left to argue about. Grant's attorney tried in the opening weeks to claim my firm as marital property subject to division, a move Alicia dismantled in a single afternoon with 16 years of tax filings showing I'd built Kessler and Associates before we married and funded every dollar of it myself, incorporation papers dated a full 2 years before our wedding license. I got half of the joint accounts minus, as it turned out, the $88,000 Grant owed the company, which the board, meaning Todd and Carol, since Grant recused himself under pressure that had, by then, very little give left in it, Formally agreed I'd earned back through 6 years of unpaid conflict of interest exposure, structured as a settlement that made my own attorney raise her eyebrows in something like respect when the number finally came through. Grant kept the house on Marymount Avenue, which surprised some people. I didn't want it. I'd never once, in 16 years, felt like the ridgeline view was the one I actually wanted to wake up to. I heard secondhand that Renee Foster and the 2 children moved out of the Sourwood Lane house within the year, that Grant's role at Pruitt Monuments shrank down to something closer to a paid consultant than an owner, that he sold his half of the family's original Stoneyard property to Todd for less than it was worth, in a hurry. The way people sell things when they need cash and no longer have the standing to negotiate. I don't know the rest, and I've stopped asking. Some numbers, once they're reconciled, you don't need to keep checking. It's a year and a half now since that night at the depot. I live in a small house up past Weaverville, not the apartment I signed under my maiden name. That was only ever meant to be temporary, a place to stand while I figured out where I actually wanted to land. I bought this one myself, closed on it in cash, my name only on the deed, which felt, the day I signed it, like the quietest and most complete sentence I'd ever written. My house has a porch that faces west toward the ridgeline, and most evenings, if the weather holds, I sit out there around 9 o'clock with my laptop and the day's figures and a mug that says "Trust the numbers," the same one, chipped handle and all, because some things you don't replace, you just keep using until they've earned every mark on them. I go through the firm's numbers first, then my own, the way I always have. There's no drawing to find folded into anyone's laundry anymore. There's just the ridgeline going purple, and the numbers adding up the way they're supposed to, and nobody in this house who isn't exactly who they say they are. Kessler and Associates is up to 19 employees now, and we moved last year into a bigger storefront 2 doors down from the old one, with my name in brass letters on the glass this time instead of vinyl. I took on Todd's business formally as a client again last spring. Pruitt Monuments -1 Pruitt, a decision I thought about for a long time before I made it, sitting with it the way I sit with any decision that has more than one column to it. I liked Earl. I like Todd, and I like Carol, who still calls me every few months just to talk, not about Grant, about nothing in particular. The way you call someone who turned out to be family after all, even after the paperwork said otherwise. Some loyalties, it turns out, were never really about the marriage at all. People ask me sometimes at dinners at the Rare Industry Conference whether I regret the 16 years, whether I feel like I wasted them. I don't, and I've stopped explaining why to people who wouldn't understand the answer anyway. I built a business, a reputation, and a set of instincts that never once, in the end, let me down even when I badly wanted them to be wrong. I was never the fool in that marriage. I was just the one still doing the math after everyone else had stopped. I know exactly what I'm worth. I never needed him to tell me.